Thank you so much for being here, Dare. Such a huge fan of your work.
Thank you.
And it's interesting, right? Before we started recording, we were talking about revision as it comes to workshops, right? As you're preparing to teach a class and you are like tinkering, you said tinkering till the last moment. And you said as poets, that's what we do, right? And the poem of yours that like, I have thought about that poem maybe every week since I heard you read it at the Wild and Precious Life series. It's a poem about, and I'm sorry I don't remember the title, but it's the poem about the first computer virus, and it's an erasure of an erasure of an erasure, right? And it's sort of, so these revisions are living together on the page at the same time, these versions of the poem, and as you sort of distill and distill, the meaning shifts of virus, of infection, of secret keeping, of fun, right? And I wondered if you could talk about that poem a little bit. Tell us the title. I'm sorry I didn't.
Sure. It's called Space Invaders. And interestingly enough, okay, so that poem was, I have to shout out to the great poet F. Douglas Brown, because that poem, he pulled that poem out of me during a workshop that we did when I was in Penn America. And basically it was a research poem. But it started out as he had us do a timeline of starting with our birth year and writing out like our birth year, and then from memory, like think of and like take 5 minutes and think of like all the important moments you've had in your life and like write it down. Like, so all the moves, if you're, if you've been accepted to school, if you're a parent, if you've been married, and just and think of the year. So it became this long bracket. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, I think we chose 3, and then we were 3 years, and then we were to Wikipedia that year. So I chose my birth year, which I will reveal was 1982.
A fine year.
And I pulled this thing, I pulled this thing up on Wikipedia, and it just revealed itself. And I just, as poets, when we are told write what you know, but I've also learned write what you research, and so the minute I came across that article, I was like, it was almost like everything went black and like the spotlight came down. I was like, this is it. And interestingly enough, it had a title before, because the title of the actual virus in the game that the person made was called Elk Cloner. And I had been writing these other poems that had sort of like deer in them. So I kept that for a long time, but I felt after a while and sort of doing like revision or variation, is that it really became this sort of like what it was speaking to in terms of like relationships. So it was like, the speaker and this other boy as, game players, because the virus was it was buried in a game. So I thought of a game title from that era. And then I thought how interesting it would be to be called Space Invaders, because virus, and how a virus invades space and the human body. And there's a lot of ways in which we can think of space invaders, right? Like, how many times have I been a space invader, So I was playing with all of that. And then I came across what's called a burning Haibun from Torrin Greathouse. And that was my attempt at doing that. So part of the poem is also what she's doing too. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna give this a try. And then what's interesting,
I just wanted to, Haibun is a sort of block of text that ends with a haiku, right?
Yes.
That's that form.
Yeah. And then what Torin did was, in the burning haibun, there's erasures.
Oh.
So I was like, that's really cool. Okay, I want to attempt that. And also it was my attempt at, because I mean, I guess I have to say this now because I wrote it and so I own it. But I before that, like, I didn't consider myself a poet of, say, like, hybrid text or found text, or like using research, or even attempting visually to get into a Word doc and do the black highlighter. And that was kind of interesting and maddening, actually.
Yeah, I bet.
Because
just like logistically.
yeah, exactly. And then when you're going in and you're trying to like make your revisions, but you're trying to have something visually interesting happen. And then also, it's not as easy as you would think. Like, I thought, I'll just make this highlighter black and do it. And that's actually not what happens. This other thing starts to happen. So you have to go in and do something else. And so then when you highlight the words, it also changes the movement too of the text. So yeah.
It's such an interesting
That's
thing
sort
you
of
said. You said that as a writer, you are told to write what you know. But as a human, I think we have a responsibility to change what we know, right? To know more stuff. And that is where research becomes this really essential part of not stagnating as an artist, right? Because I think there's a line
yeah.
the poet John Sands says in It's a Lot, his poem, It's a Lot. He says, it's a lot to not become a caricature of your grief. And I think, or not turn yourself maybe into a caricature of your grief. And I think if we're not like researching and changing what we know, you just, that can happen in an artistic life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was in a workshop with Dawn Lundy Martin, and it was incredible. And she also had us do we had to research around the body and any sort of but we couldn't, there was restrictions, and I'm totally forgetting, but there were restrictions on it. So what we came across, I think it was like any terms that dealt directly with the body we couldn't use in the poem. And so it was, yeah, but we had to research about something that the body does, or something that happens to the body, and look up medical journals, essentially. And that's always interesting, of like the way of just like taking from the research and then trying to, okay, so what's my language in there? How do I put like my own language in there?
Yeah.
And fuse the two together.
And do you, when you're writing by yourself, because I mean, I think workshops are such a phenomenal and necessary part of my practice, because I sort of am able to just like sit in almost the passenger seat, right? And just do what I'm told. But I struggle with putting those constraints on myself when I'm writing by myself. Do you do that? Like, what's your relationship with that?
Yeah, I mean, lately, like what I also struggle with too is that I can be sort of a I would say, like, especially with everything that's been going on in the last like year or so, I am such a slow responder in terms of like, I am soaking in the information. So when it's like, I'm given all this information and then we have 10 minutes to write something, I'm like, what do I even have? It's like, which I'm going to do later, I'm going to talk about later, but it's like, I'm in awe of people who can really just like right there, do it. And
Right.
it takes me a minute to sort of marinate in everything that is presented to me. I will say, like, my writing practice right now has been, I'm doing a lot of just like, well, I'm a journaler, which I will talk about in the workshop, but
Daily? Or
often
are you a
what's
daily
that?
journaler?
I am,
Wonderful.
yeah, with like to-do list. It goes into to-do lists, but often as I'm doing the mind dump, then a poem may emerge. I don't even want to call it that yet.
Right.
Something will start to emerge in line breaks that may or may not have musicality that I know is very different than a journal entry. I'm very clear about that. Like,
Yeah.
and I've been sort of letting them, I've been letting them sit in the journal, because the minute, I don't know if this is how it is for you, but the minute I take from the journal to the Word doc, I'm already in revision.
Yes, yes. It starts to
like
become
I
a
eat, like
product.
I can never, yeah, exactly. I can, it's really rare for me to take exactly what's on the page with pen to paper and put it into the Word doc without making changes. That might be a challenge. That might be something that might be a practice or an exercise for myself. Like, what can I take a week? And if I do that, can I move the text as is to the white space
Yeah. Yeah.
without any changes?
Without any changes, right? Without any correction. And sometimes when I
Uh-huh.
edit the thing, like I have rarely I've just like typed a poem into Facebook when I was using Facebook a bit better, or Instagram or something, where it's just like it happens and I put it into the Instagram, into the Facebook. It's that spotlight moment that you were talking about where it's just like, oh, this has to happen.
Mhm.
And then I'll go mess with the poem to like make it a poem worthy of X or Y thing or submission. And something about the magic gets like evaporated. It gets techniqued out. And that's such a bummer when that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a lot of poems in my notes app. As like a city person who often will take public transit, it's gotta just, language is also, it gets in there. I guess I want to offer something that Gabrielle Calvacaresi, who is a huge inspiration for the workshop I'm going to do, they talk about, rather than calling it revision, calling it a variation, which sort of takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
Because when we, as writers who publish and are submitting, when we think of revision, I think you had spoken to something about this earlier, of like, we're working towards making the poem this thing, this like publishable product. And
Right.
so like we revise this like raw document towards something. And I think sometimes that seeps in. And so if we can think about variation, then it takes the pressure off. And what I will say too, I totally talk to my poems.
Say more about
So,
this.
so when I am working on a poem and I'm like working on it and it almost feels overworked, or maybe I feel like I'm not getting somewhere with the poem because I'm working on variations, what I will do in the same Word doc is I create another page and I go, okay, I'm going to do some wild stuff to you, but I have you in this other form. And so I want you to know that you're safe. So I have like the rough draft, and then maybe what I was trying to revise or do a variation on. And then the third page, or like however many pages, is where I offer myself and the poem radical revision just to see what happens. But I keep it safe somewhere else so that it doesn't feel like I'm hurting it.
Ah, what a tender like ritual and relationship to have with your work. I love that so much. And that's
Because I
often,
think too, like we get scared.
yeah.
Like we're like, oh no, like if I kill my darlings, or if I like snip this, or
And there's
yeah,
a thing too, and I think it's what makes art making and in all forms so compelling and different than much of like sort of craft or sort of hobby stuff, um, is that there is a percentage, I would say, I'm just going to throw this, like 5 and 10%, between 5 and 10% of just like not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing whether it's going to be any, like there's magic in that process that you don't know if it's going to show up or not, right? It's not like every time I go to build, like if I was building a table, I would, cut everything and it would be the same table. Well, if somebody else was building a table, if I was building a table, it'd be terrible. But if somebody who knew how to build a table, it would, right? It turns out the same way
yeah,
every time, but we're not creating the same thing again and again. And that spotlight thing that I loved, and I'm going to keep saying, um, that spotlight thing, it seems to shine on us at its own will. And you can't see what's a spotlight poem and what's not for a good time after leaving the page.
yeah. I mean, yeah, and also I think we have total permission to say that if we are to be haunted by language, um, it really comes sometimes at like inconvenient times. I'm falling asleep or I'm making dinner and a line comes in and I'm like, oh man, okay, I have to write this down.
Right.
And I'm grateful for that, super grateful for that. But it is interesting that um, it comes when it comes. And I've been taught that we have to snatch it.
Yeah. And this super tender ritual of talking to your poems, which is, I love it so much. I'm going to think of it a lot.
Yeah.
Um, are there any other rituals that you have to enter into your work to prepare your mind? Or maybe some rituals that you've developed during this scary and spacious time?
Yeah. I keep my crystals around. I pull tarot. Um, I have jazz playing all the time. Incense, like I just get like the vibe
Just all of it.
going. Um, but I would say like I guess what I would say is in the last year is a ritual would be to just sort of like forgo all like rituals in a way,
Mm,
of like and what I mean by that is rigid, like um rigor maybe, like this idea of like I have to be writing every day. I sort of let myself off the hook. I think something that's been coming up too is that in the conversations I've been seeing, with poets especially, is like this pressure and this idea that we have to be like first responder poets. Um,
yeah.
because the market is all, there's
Oh,
already
right.
anthologies of what's going on, right? So you don't have to, I don't have to. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love, yes, this
Even
first
though,
responder. And it comes back to what you were saying at the beginning. It's like, it also, I'm similarly, it takes me a long time to figure out what I think of a thing. Sometimes it's many years before I know what I think of a thing. And the pace is,
totally.
it seems like everything's moving a bit faster than I can't even manage to read about something
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah. And I know that like you've talked about silence, and I think one of the things that's helped me in the last few years is pausing, like really having that pause. And when I'm asked about what I think of something, if I don't know like how I feel about something, to not like give an answer because I want to like appease the other person or please them, and to literally just say, you know what? I don't know how I feel about that. And I need some space and time
It's such a
to
wise,
reach my own conclusion.
yeah, it's such a wise thing, because I think it's a younger version of myself always felt like I had to say something, right?
Yeah,
And
I
it's,
owe you. Yeah, I had to. I owe you
I
like an
owe
answer
you,
or
slash, I should like elbow in here and like like make my voice heard, and that's not necessarily what a moment needs. And so, United Against Silence is the name of this podcast and our collective. And the very right up top in your bio, you say that you're HIV positive, which is such a bold refusal to remain silent. You know, you're this about the same age as me. I'm a little bit older than you, just so you know. Gonna call that rank, class of '98 over here. Um, but so we came through that really terrifying, stigmatized sort of language around HIV/AIDS, and
Mhm,
you have refused that. Can you say something
mhm.
or anything about that decision? Or, I mean, it's just it's such an important thing to overcome silence, to say a
Yeah,
thing that so many people are also experiencing. But it's hard to be the one who does it still.
yeah. Yeah, so I have to owe all of that to Dennis Smith. When I first encountered their work and I read that in their bio, I thought, yeah, absolutely. I have to, I, well, and there's a lot of other things that I've experienced in my life that have taught me to not shrink and not, and have that be, it informs my work. It informs, a lot of what I do in the community. And so I felt it necessary to say that. And it was scary at first. And I made the decision probably about a year before I was accepted as a PEN America Emerging Voices. And I sat with it, and then realized like, oh, I'm sitting with this because I come from an era where it was, or like my feelings about like maybe I should or shouldn't, it's like I am in between two generations. So
Right.
there's the generation behind me that I learned from, and then there's the generation after me that don't quite know the generation that we grew up with, right?
Right.
And so I really felt like um I needed to be vocal about that and not be silent.
I love that. And I love the
And
way
it's
that,
important that,
sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Well, it's just important that tells you, what kind of community I'm in, and that I am a body that's under attack,
Yes.
both internally and externally,
Yeah.
from the state and from, you know,
Right.
yeah.
Um, and I think there are these people, right? So you read it in Denez Smith's bio, and somebody else will read it in your bio and decide to claim, and this is how we undo systems of abuse and silencing, right? Like each of us in our own way, using the space that we take up, whether it's like on a book flap or the bio in a lit mag, to be like, hey, me too, you too, we, us, you're not alone. Um, it's sometimes it feels very, very, very good to be on this planet. And you saying that is one of those moments where I'm like, yeah.